Hello, and welcome to the most recent of my COVID-19 online lectures. Today, I'm going to be getting into something that's a little bit controversial, and I'm going to be a little more opinionated than normal. Normally, I keep my opinions out of my classrooms, and I'm not going to be really opinionated, but there's some things that I think that others disagree with that I'm going to be exploring today. I'm supposed to, the university tells me that I'm supposed to teach my students about how power and privilege function in a society. And so this is going to deal with that. And I'm going to do it to the best of my ability. So here we go. Not much raises blood pressure on a college campus more than when people start talking about privilege. That seems to be sort of a hot button issue that people feel pretty strongly about in different ways. And it's going to be the topic of this conversation today. When I was in college, I had a friend, and we'll call her Kelly because that was her name. And Kelly is a great person, really nice person, hardworking, good friend, just an all around really good person. And I liked her and I respected her. And we hung out a decent amount. And it was also the fact that Kelly's family was pretty wealthy. I'm not talking like really rich. She's not like from the billionaire class, but her family was pretty wealthy. But she was, not snooty or anything like that. She was just a nice regular person. Anyway, one time in the spring semester, she said, "You know what you should do this summer? You should go backpacking around Europe." And I smiled and said, "Yeah, that's not really going to happen." See, I was middle class kid, solidly middle class, and I needed to use my summers working. I'd go home and get the job I could get that would pay the most, and I'd work full time at that during the summer to make money. So I'd have money for the next school year, typically doing something like construction work. And so when she said I should spend my summer backpacking around Europe, I thought that was kind of funny, but also a little bit annoying because I found it a little frustrating that she didn't realize the advantages that she had because her family was wealthier and she could afford to do things like that. And so we encounter situations like that from time to time, and we can find them a little flustering. And we want that other person to just recognize, yeah, you've got some privileges in life that not everyone else has. So let's start off with that fact. Privilege is real, right? There are privileges that certain people have that others do not that make their life easier and better. And that's just a reality that people have privilege. And what makes things even more challenging is that privileges compound one another. And there's something that's called the Matthew effect. And the Matthew effect is based on a saying of Jesus that's found in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus says, "For unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance. But from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath." And I decided to go with the Old English King James on that. But the idea here is what? The idea here is that Jesus is saying, those that have will be given more, and those that have not, even what they have will be taken from them. And this, what's called the Matthew effect sometimes, manifests itself in all sorts of ways. And if we're talking about wealth, we can see that those who have wealth have an advantage to accumulate even more wealth. And those who have little wealth are in a situation where they are even more likely to have what they have taken away or reduced. And so if you have wealth, then you can make significant investments. You can pay off your car immediately and not have to pay high interest rates. And so the more money you have, the more money you can make. And the less money you have, the more you're likely to get screwed. The wealthy person can buy a nicer car that doesn't need maintenance and upkeep. The person who can only afford an old junker is going to have to spend even more money getting that car fixed from time to time, possibly losing work and therefore losing even more money. And so that's just a reality, right? We might think that that's not fair, and I suppose it's not, but that is just simply a reality that exists in the world. Now, wealth is a big one, right? When we're talking about privilege, wealth is a big one, perhaps the biggest one. But there are other privileges that people have as well. So beauty, right? If you're one of the beautiful people, you've got a major privilege in life. And things not only are easier for you because you're beautiful, not only do you have the benefit of being beautiful, but that's going to tend to magnify itself in benefits for you for your entire life. If you're beautiful, more people want to get to know you and spend time with you. And therefore, you're able to network more. And therefore, you may get a better job. And therefore, you may get a spouse who has more assets. And therefore, you got more wealth. And therefore, you can accumulate more, and so on and so on. And so beauty is a privilege that can really make a big difference in a person's life. And similarly, intelligence, right? Intelligence is also a privilege. Those people who are smart, and life is just going to be a lot easier. If you can get ready for your exam and ace your exam after an hour of studying, compared to the other person who might have to spend 4 hours studying, well, your life is just suddenly 3 hours longer. And you can use that time to prepare for another class. You can use that time to get a good night's sleep and therefore be better prepared the next day. You can use that time to go socialize and make more friends and do all sorts of things. So intelligence also plays in to the Matthew effect, and is a major privilege that some people have. And we want them to know that. We want them to recognize that they have this advantage. Now, I've come across sometimes people say, well, we want to eliminate privilege. We want to do away with privilege, as if privilege is some sort of social phenomenon that exists in some societies and doesn't exist in others. And it's just a man-made thing and we could get rid of it. But that's not going to happen. That's not possible. You can't eliminate privilege or the benefits of privilege. They're just real. As long as we have disparities, we're going to have privilege. As long as you have a disparity in wealth, and aside from a few humanities professors running around, most people think that, yeah, disparities of wealth in society are probably a good thing, right? They can go too far, but we don't necessarily want everyone to have the same exact wealth. And even if you do, right, you're not going to change the fact that some people are more intelligent than others. You're not going to change the fact that some people are more beautiful than others. And so because of that, you're never going to erase privilege. As long as there are differences, some traits will carry advantages. And having those advantages, whether they're earned or not, is going to confer privilege on those who carry them. And this is just something that's unavoidable. Now, we can try to minimize the effects of that fact, especially when they're unfair. And when the Matthew effect gets out of hand and you have too much of a disparity of resources, then yeah, we need to step in and do something. And we'll talk about that later. But the phenomenon of privilege is simply a biological fact. Okay, what about the big one? What about the one that everyone talks about? Why isn't this working? Here we go. Bam, white privilege, right? This is the one that usually comes up first when we talk about privilege, talk about white privilege. And there's some others that people talk about when they talk about male privilege or cis privilege and others. But let's start off with this big one, white privilege. Okay. I don't actually like to talk about white privilege. No, this is not because it makes me feel guilty. And no, it's not because I don't think there's anything behind the idea of white privilege. But rather, I just think that the phrase itself is a misnomer. I don't think that that phrase, white privilege, is an accurate phrase or a helpful phrase. And so rather, what I prefer to do is to talk about relative advantages and disadvantages. So what happens, though, a lot of times when we talk about this, is people will make up definitions for words that fit their case. Now, the word privilege suggests some sort of special situation that a person has, that a minority group has, right? Minority meaning a smaller group within society. And so it is a special situation that people have if they have privilege. And white people in the United States are the majority. And so if they do have certain advantages, I don't think it's appropriate to call that privilege. But some people have, knowing that that's the case, have fiddled with the definition of privilege. And so here's one definition of privilege that some people have suggested. They say privilege is unasked for, invisible, unearned, available to members of majority group members in an organization, often mistaken for individual merit by majority group members. Okay, so the first, well, let's look at unasked for and unearned. Sometimes that is the case, right? People who are just inherently gifted in intelligence, they didn't earn that, they didn't ask for it. It was just something that they received by luck of the biological lottery. But there are people who've worked really hard and made money for themselves. And we already noted that wealth is a major privilege. So sometimes it is earned, sometimes it is asked for. Invisible, I'm not even exactly sure what this person has in mind with this definition, but beauty is certainly a visible form of privilege. And so there are times that you can very clearly see what privilege is. Available to members of majority group members in an organization. I think what they're talking about here is when they're talking about a country like the United States, where you have the majority or those in power, white males, white straight Christian males, and very often those things that does correlate with privilege or advantages. But if you can have someone like Beyonce, who is beautiful, who is talented, who is wealthy, who is influential, and she's a Black woman. And so she has privileges that I do not, and I don't begrudge her that. But she's not in the majority group of straight white males the way that I am. And so I think that our final comment here is about that sort of principle as well. So what you find sometimes is that people are playing games with definitions in order to attain the political end that they're seeking. So a better definition, this isn't a great one, but I think it's a better definition of privilege, is this: a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group of people. And so the key word here is that it's a special right. This is something that is available to the few, right? Whether they be the wealthy, the beautiful, the talented, or whatever it might be. So is this me being pedantic? Is this me being fussy? And just, you know, the way that professors can be with words, and that's not the exact word, that's not the exact right word, maybe. But I think there is something more at stake here when you talk about the advantages, talking about advantages and disadvantages as opposed to privilege. And first of all, we know that people don't like to be called privileged, right? When you say, well, you have privilege, no one is like, yeah, that's true. And you know, we see it as an affront, as some sort of attack very often. And so when you use the word privilege or overuse the word privilege, you're going to get defensiveness from people. But if you tell people, look, you have certain advantages in life, we all know that that's the case. We all know that we have certain advantages and disadvantages. And we can talk about that a little more, honestly, a little less defensively, I think. So I think that's one advantage, in addition to just purely the proper definition of the word. The other thing is that we know that disadvantages can sometimes be changed into advantages. They're not fixed things. And so what is a disadvantage one day may actually be able to be turned into or used as an advantage the next day or in another place. And so we don't have this overly static notion of privileged and unprivileged. Advantages and disadvantages, we know that they can vary in terms of how they manifest themselves. Okay. So, are there advantages to being white in America? Overall, yeah, sure, of course, right? Are there advantages to being male? Overall, yeah. I think you'd have a hard time making the case that in general, throughout the United States, on average, life isn't a bit easier for people who are white and are male and are cisgender and are heterosexual. These things are true, right? And so I don't think anyone is going to deny that there are people of other ethnic or racial groups who can face challenges that white folks don't, right? Sometimes they face distrust from the people that they meet. Sometimes they face discrimination in terms of hiring. Sometimes they face assumptions about who they are and where they're from and what they're good at and what they're not good at. And so, yeah, those are real things. And by no means am I going to deny that that's the case. And I don't think anyone should, if we're talking in general. And let me give you one small example that you may not have thought of before. So I live here in central Pennsylvania, and the area that I live in is predominantly white. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And so if I ever want to get a haircut, actually my wife doesn't, but if she's not around and I want to get a haircut, then I can go to any barber, any salon and get my haircut, and it's no big deal. And my mom who lives nearby, right, same thing. She wants to get a haircut, she can go to any salon that cuts women's hair and she can get her hair done. Now, if you are a Black man or woman who lives in this area, you don't have that same advantage. Because maybe you never thought about this before, but white people hair is different than Asian people hair, which is different than Black people hair, right? And so they have to be cut differently. And especially for Black women, there are certain expertise, there's a certain skill set that goes with cutting Black women's hair, styling Black women's hair. And it's not the same as what goes into doing white women's hair. And so if you're a Black woman living in this area, you don't have the advantage that my mom does, that you can go to any salon and know that the person is going to be qualified to cut your hair. And so you might have to travel a lot further. You might have to, and you're going to have fewer choices available to you. Now, this isn't the biggest deal in the world, but it's a real issue. And it might be one that you never thought about before. So are there times that white folks have advantages in life that they didn't even think about or realize? Sure. And when you're in the majority, it's easy to not notice these things. So is there an advantage to being white in America? Yeah, absolutely. I don't like to call that white privilege though. Okay, so a lot of times on college campuses, we talk about these things and, excuse me, there's something that is done in classrooms or that you might see in videos, and this is the famous privilege walk. And I don't know if you've ever seen these or been part of them. Everyone lines up in a straight line, side to side. And the idea is, you're trying to ultimately move forward in life, but before you actually start moving, let's see who has certain advantages and disadvantages. And they'll ask questions. And you can take a step forward or take a step back, depending on your answer to these questions. And so at the end, you look around and realize, oh, not everyone is in the same starting place, right? And is there a benefit to this? I think there is. I think that these sort of privilege walks can make an important point to people who may not have thought about this before. They may not have thought about how these things function in life and that we're all not starting from the same place. And so this can be an eye-opening experience for people, and I think it's got value. But I think, again, just like everything else we're talking about here, there's a stereotype involved. There's an oversimplification of what the situation really is. And this is the big point I want to get across in this lecture, is our discussions of privilege are way too oversimplified. And the privilege walk is the same way. So the questions that you pick are going to determine the results, right? You have to pick which questions to ask these people. And I've read through a whole bunch of these and seen how people do it. And what I generally find is that there's an emphasis on certain questions. There are questions that are designed to point out whether you have more or if you grew up with more or fewer financial resources. There are questions about sexual identity. There are questions about race and ethnicity. And these things are all relevant. But that's where the focus is. And while those are some important things to consider, there are others as well that don't seem to make their way into the privilege walk. I've never seen a privilege walk where they address issues of attractiveness, right? They never say, okay, if you're really attractive, take a step forward. And if you're an uggo, take a step back. And everyone else is between like a 4 and a 7, 4 and an 8, just stay where you are. Right? No, they don't do that, but we know that attractiveness is huge when it comes to advantages in life. And the same way with intelligence, right? No one's like, all right, smart people, if your SATs were over this, move forward. And if you're a dumb, take a step back, right? No one does this. And I know I'm using that sort of ridiculous language, but obviously you can't do that in a setting like that, right? Because it would have that effect. And so they're not asking about these. And so the privilege walks make a point, but they're not anywhere close to being nuanced enough to get at the heart of what's really going on with advantages and racial privilege or racial advantages and disadvantages. And even then, when you get to this, a lot of times when you talk about race and ethnicity, then a lot of times it's white folks and people of color. And I don't like that phrase, people of color. But this is where they often are going to draw the distinction. Were you white or are you not white? As if all non-white people have the same experience. And so that's also, you know, a little bit problematic. Do Pakistanis and Vietnamese and Brazilians and people from Ukraine, do they, well, actually we'll leave out folks from Ukraine, right? Do those other folks all have the same experience in America? And do the Ukrainian immigrants have the same experience as the rest of white people? So the whole white versus people of color thing is problematic. And likewise, I mean, you can just look at it, even we just talked about Hispanics, as if Hispanics were all one group. Does the, you know, the daughter of an Argentinian college professor have the same advantages, disadvantages, experiences as the son of a Guatemalan immigrant, right? And so again, privilege walk in a lot of these discussions, not nuanced enough by a long shot. So what we really start to see at this point, and I'm hoping what you realize, is that the way we talk about privilege, way too simple, because it doesn't take into account all sorts of things. So what about all sorts of other important matters when it comes to relative advantages and disadvantages in life? Did you have two parents when you grew up? Were you on the autism spectrum? Did you grow up with an extended family in the neighborhood? Was there crime in your neighborhood? Are you gay? Are you transgender? What's the educational attainment of your parents? Did you come from a society or a culture where education was emphasized or not emphasized? What's your height? Are you and there's a difference between being a tall man and a tall woman. There's advantages and disadvantages that can go with those. Are you healthy? Are you athletic? Are there issues of mental health problems in you yourself or in your family? And so all these different factors come into play when you're trying to make sense of what advantages and disadvantages do people have. So here's where we see just how limited our conversations of white privilege or male privilege really, we see how way oversimplified that they are. And so a lot of times what happens is people look at the educational and professional attainment of certain groups, specifically racial groups, right? And then see, because there's a correlation, then that must suggest some discrimination or inherent disadvantage or privilege or not. And there's certainly something there to be examined, but again, it's far more nuanced than that. So is there an advantage or a privilege to being from a Black immigrant family in the United States, or being natural born Black Americans? Because there's a difference in educational and professional attainments there. And so do we figure in some sort of immigrant privilege? Is there Jewish privilege? If we're going to look at these sort of factors. And so these are things that have to be considered. Or is there an Asian privilege over whites, right? Asians outperform whites in education and in financial success in life. And so is there an Asian privilege? And so I think a simple answer to that, of course, is going to be inadequate. All right, I worry that I'm sort of just problematizing and not getting us anywhere, but I'm going to problematize it a little bit more. Contexts, right? So context change. And so what may be an advantage in one place may be a disadvantage in another, even if you have the same identity, and that can go in either direction. So in certain places, right, you have a college community right near a local community. And so you have the town and gown divide, right? And so in the local community, in certain places in America, being a Black man could be a disadvantage if you were applying for a job. But you cross that line onto the college campus, and being a Black man is a significant advantage when applying for a job. And similarly, even if we look around the country, right? If you're Korean, how does that affect your life and your prospects if you live in Seattle or if you live in rural Arkansas? I don't know. And so we can't think that these are static things. And gender, race, ethnicity, all sorts of things. Again, if you're mildly on the autism spectrum, that can be an asset in some places, in some professions, and a liability in others. And so too simplified of an assessment is going to be a real problem. So with all that in mind, let me know if you can answer this. Who has it easier? An attractive girl brought up by a working class Puerto Rican family in the Bronx, or an autistic boy of Greek heritage raised in an upper middle class single parent home in West Virginia? Don't know? Neither do I. Not that these things aren't all individually relevant, but right, people talk a lot these days about intersectionality. There is so much intersectionality that's going on with this, that our oversimplified notions of privilege are not addressing the reality on the ground. So what do we do? I've made a mess of things. So what do we do with all of this? Well, first, I think we have to stop throwing out vague, condescending comments like, check your privilege. First of all, no one likes to hear that, and it's not very helpful. It's sort of like saying, though, you've missed something, or you've made an error in your logic, right? There are people who have privilege who don't realize that. And so the idea behind saying check your privilege is to say you've missed something, you didn't realize something. Okay, but that's not an argument. That's the preface to an argument. You then have to explain, like my friend in college, you didn't realize that you have the privilege of more money and don't have to work in the summer in order to have money for the school year. And with any of these, right? Check your privilege is only a preface. It is not an argument. End it with a comma, not with a period. Otherwise, it's just a meaningless way to sort of shut someone up because they don't really know how to respond to that. I think the second thing we can do then is to recognize the advantages that we have and that others don't. And there are all sorts of them. And that's why I wanted to talk about so many, right? Because it's not simply a couple different categories, and it's the intersectionality of a whole lot of different categories. And so if you stop and you think about it, you can recognize certain advantages that you have and that others might not. And I think that that's really important. We don't want to limit it to identity politics. It involves so many different aspects of life. There are countless relative advantages and disadvantages that we have in relation to one another. And these can change from day to day and place to place. But the more we explore this, the more we think about it, the more we look into it, the more empathy I think we have for those whose lives are harder than ours in various respects. And if you recognize that you have it easier in one respect and someone else has it harder, creates more empathy for that person, it creates more appreciation for that person, and it overcomes some hubris, right? Some pride when we think we're getting ahead because we're just so much more awesome, instead of recognizing we've had certain advantages. I think it's more likely to add a little humility to our lives. When you have advantages that got you so far, then it puts some more perspective, I think, in life, and can add empathy and can add humility. And lastly, you know, where we see unfair discrimination based on the relative advantages and disadvantages that people have in ourselves and in others, we can find ways to reduce or eliminate it, right? We talked about wealth at the very beginning. Wealth is quite a privilege, and the Matthew effect, which magnifies that. And we reach a point when we say, okay, we've reached a point where we're a little bit concerned about how this is playing out and the condition of those who have less. Then you do something about it. We can argue about what we should do. We can argue about what that should look like, but there comes a point in time when we say, yeah, things have gotten unfair and we need to do something about this. And we can better appreciate the situation of those who might need a helping hand, right? Why is it that they might be struggling, and what is it that might actually help them in this situation? But as I said, and you're probably tired of hearing at this point, we have to recognize that we're dealing with a reality that is infinitely more nuanced and not a simple matter of this group or that having privilege or not privilege. We need to explore it with much more sophistication than is often getting treated on college campuses. Now, with that, I want to conclude this lecture, this presentation, with a short video clip from one of my favorite philosophers. So I'm going to let him speak, and I will let him have the last word. And I do hope that you will feel free to comment, critique, question, challenge me on anything that I've said, and in the comments below or in the personal communication. So let me scoot on over to that other person, and we'll let him finish this up.
How the hell you doing, world? So Catfish Cooler here coming in with another life lesson. This ladder stayed in the house yesterday. This ladder stayed outside. Right off the bat, this ladder looked better than this ladder. That's how we view people. We don't take into consideration that this poor bastard stayed outside all night in the cold and the rain and all the other shit. And sometimes all you need in life is a little bit of help. So y'all don't be too quick to judge. We all go through shit. Be there for somebody sometimes. They may need you, by God, you may need them. Y'all be cool and stay classy. I love you.